Welcome to When Independence Led to Chaos, Authority in the Early 18th Century Dutch Reformed Church, presented by Dr. Kenneth P. Shefsiek. My name is Emily Shamidas. I'm the director of the Hudson Area Library. I'm your Brenda for this evening, our history room coordinator who usually introduces all of our events and welcomes you all, was not able to join us tonight, so I'm filling in for her. And this is the fourth of our annual Leisler Lecture collaborations. We are joined by David Voorhees, founder and director of the Jacob Leisler Institute for Early New York History, who will introduce our guests this evening. We thank David for bringing the Leisler Lectures, now in their 6th year, to our library. The Leisler Institute, which houses an important archive of colonial New York under British rule, is located in Hudson. And David is co-founder and director of the Institute and managing editor of De Halfmoon. Am I pronouncing it right? Yeah. Awesome. Close. The Half Moon, a quarterly scholarly journal published by the Holland Society of New York. So I'm going to invite David to come up to introduce our speaker. Thank you, David.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. It's again with appreciation that I thank the Hudson Area Library for hosting the Jacob Leisler Institute Lecture Series. This series, which introduces the latest scholarship into colonial New York and New Jersey, is made possible through the generous support of the Van Dyke Family Foundation, the Hudson River Bank and Trust Foundation, and the Bank of Greene County Charitable Foundation, as well as numerous private donors. Our speaker this evening is Kenneth Shefsiek, who is, Dr. Shefsiek is Associate Professor of Early American and Public History at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He holds graduate degrees in history, historic preservation, and music, including a PhD in American history from the University of Georgia. Before joining UNCW, he served as curator of education at historic Huguenot Street in New Paltz, an executive director at the Geneva Historical Society. Author of numerous articles, his 2017 book, Set in Stone, Creating and Commemorating a Hudson Valley Culture, explores ethnoculture transformation in colonial New York through French-speaking community established in a Dutch cultural region in an English colony. These are in his words. His current project, A God of Order, considers the challenges that the Reformed churches in America faced as they transported European ecclesiastical governing models to a colonial context. Tonight, Dr. Shefsiek will address the conflict that afflicted the Dutch Reformed churches in mid-18th century America, particularly the chaos created by troublesome New York minister, the Reverend Bernardus Freeman, who had destabilized congregations from Schenectady to Long Island. Please help me welcome Kenneth Shefsiek.
And thank you, David. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Library and the Leisler Institute for hosting this tonight. When I left, I finished class yesterday. I told students what I was going to be talking about, undergraduates, and I said I would bring any of them that wanted to come with me to hear about it. You don't see any here. So I hope you would enjoy it more than they thought they would enjoy it. So in the history of the Dutch Reformed Church in colonial America, no event looms larger than what is known as the Cetus Conferentia dispute, which concerned the relationship between the Dutch Reformed ministers and congregations in the British colonies in America and church assemblies in the Netherlands, particularly the Classis of Amsterdam. At the time of the dispute, which began in the 1730s and did not end until the 1770s, ministers on both sides of the Atlantic held to the belief that the American church was subordinate to the Classis of Amsterdam and always had been. While those in the Conferentia aimed to preserve that status quo, those in the Cetus sought independence from the Classis. Modern historians have understood that history from a similar perspective. Since I began my research into the Dutch church in America, this view has always troubled me. I began to develop this concern when I was researching the history of a minister who began his career on Long Island, Johannes Goetjes. I had initially encountered him when I was writing my dissertation on the history of New Paltz, New York, as he had occasionally visited its congregation in the mid-18th century. In considering his background, I discovered that he and several other ministers clearly had not considered themselves subordinate to Amsterdam. For practical concerns having to do with his livelihood, he did ultimately accept subordination to the Amsterdam Classis, but I wondered whether the issue at stake was his misinterpretation of Dutch Reformed church governance, or simply that he offered an alternative interpretation of it. My second concern stemmed from the organizational structure of the Dutch Reformed Church itself, which seemed to me made American subordination antithetical to that very structure. The Dutch Church is organized hierarchically, but unlike the Catholic Church, it is a hierarchy built from the bottom up. A congregation is governed by elected elders who together formally call a minister, and with whom they govern the congregation as members of the consistory. Congregations are linked together into a regional classis, in which all the ministers in a given region are members. Classical meetings involve those ministers accompanied by representative elders from their congregations. Similarly, classes are linked together in provincial synods. In the Netherlands, the provincial synods were theoretically linked together in a national synod, but the last one that was held in the era of the Dutch Republic was at Dordrecht or Dort in 1618-1619, which produced both the canons of Dort concerning theology and the church order of Dort concerning church governance. Governing power within the church is held by higher church assemblies over lower ones, but only because the lower assemblies share in the power of those above. This shared governing structure put congregations and ministers outside of the United Provinces in a strange position, since they obviously could not participate at all levels of governance thousands of miles away. This posed an important question. If the Dutch ministers and congregations in America were subordinate to the Classis of Amsterdam, what would that subordination mean when subordination was fundamentally intertwined with participation? These observations led me to speculate that the relationship between the church in America and the church in the Netherlands during the New Netherland period might not have been precisely what either the Dutch in the 18th century nor later historians thought it had been. Through my investigations of two ministers, Wilhelmus Grasmeer and Wilhelmus Grasmeer and Johannes Polhemus, what I discovered is that while there were some ministers in North America during the New Netherland period with strong connections with Amsterdam, there were some who lacked any meaningful connection with the Classis and certainly were not subordinate to it, which no one at the time suggested was anything other than legitimate and acceptable. This clearly undermined the 18th century assertion that the church in New Netherland had been under the authority of the Classis of Amsterdam. This led to an additional question, which is what I plan to explore with you tonight, which is, if the Americans were not actually subordinate to the Classis of Amsterdam in the New Netherland period, how did the congregations and the ministers on both sides of the Atlantic come to believe that they had been? How could some in the 18th century attempt to preserve a status quo that had not ever really existed? I believe the answers to these questions in part can be found in the story of one very troublesome Dutch minister in America, the Reverend Bernardus Freeman. Freeman first became associated with the Dutch Reformed Church in America when the Manhattan congregation decided in 1697 to call a second minister. The effort was very contentious, as one faction hoped to call Kingston's minister, while the other sought a minister from the Netherlands. The contention arose in part from the ongoing partisanship that Leisler's rebellion had generated. The particular individual whom the consistory hoped to call declined, and they therefore authorized the Classis of Amsterdam to select another candidate, provided that the Classis consults with two merchants who had a stake in both New York and Amsterdam, Levinus van Schaik and Willem Bonker. These merchants suggested to the Classis that they ordain and send Bernardus Freeman. The Classis balked in part because Freeman had not been formally trained for the ministry. As they remarked to the Manhattan congregation, quote, among the candidates who presented themselves, there was a man whom Messieurs Van Schaik and Banker seemed to esteem, but since he had only recently descended from the tailor's bench, we feared that he would be subjected to the ridicule of the parties, yet we had nothing against his gifts or life. Later, the Classis was more critical. remarking that, quote, "Some time ago, the Church of New York requested us to send them a suitable minister. Bankert was a strong advocate for this Freeman, a Westphalian tailor, who had but just come from his cutting board and had neither learning nor ability. He had failed in his examination here, even when he desired to go only as a comforter of the sick. The classes unkindly opined that he had, quote, neither ability for his own craft, much less for that demanded of a pastor." Although Freeman did not gain the Manhattan pulpit, Bunker and Freeman were not finished. 2 years later, 1699, it became necessary for the Albany congregation to replace its minister, Reverend Godfridius Delius. Its consistory, as had that of Manhattan, authorized Van Schaik and Bunker, along with Delius, to work with the Classis of Amsterdam to select a new minister. The classes selected Johannes Lydius. Bankert, however, was determined to secure Freeman for the post and therefore requested of the Albany congregation that, if necessary, they allow the agents to seek a minister other than through Amsterdam. The Albany congregation conceded, and even though the Classis of Amsterdam was able to find a minister accepted to both Delius and Van Schaik, Bankert went rogue and used the consistory's authorization to approach with Freeman the Classis of Lingen in Westphalia in hopes that they would ordain him for Albany. Lingen complied. As a result, 2 ministers were sent to Albany, which created a conundrum. After a close analysis of the ecclesiastical lawfulness of the calls to both ministers, the congregation decided that Bankert had acted inappropriately and that Lydius had been legitimately selected. Still, they did not accuse Freeman of having colluded with Bankert, although exactly what Freeman knew of Bankert's action is unknown. Some churches were even willing to retain both ministers, but the congregation lacked the funds to do so. Luckily for Freeman, the Schenectady congregation was in need of a minister, and his consistory called him to serve. The reason that Bankert became such an ardent supporter of Freeman was likely due to the fact that they shared a pietistic persuasion, and pietists were sometimes willing to accept ministers who had not been university educated. Pietism is a complex topic, but suffice it to say that pietists believe that although God saved some people, even those he saved did not really deserve it. That was a belief that all Protestants did not take kindly to. Bankert, along with 2 Dutch ministers in the Netherlands, would also later be involved in securing the services of Reverend Theodorus Frelinghuysen for several congregations in New Jersey, who, while well-educated, was also a vigorous pietist. Historian James Tanis has explained these efforts by remarking that, quote, "These were all men of deep pietistic and experiential religious convictions who were eager to find men of a similar disposition to spread their views in America." Their efforts were successful, as both Freeman and Frelinghuysen did bring their pietism to America. It is important to note, however, that while Frelinghuysen's spiritual perspective would generate significant conflict, the same cannot be said for Freeman. He created disorder for entirely different reasons. Unfortunately, Freeman's congregation in Schenectady had difficulty paying him. To better support himself, Freeman therefore made financial arrangements with the provincial government to teach the local Native Americans, although he was never paid for doing so. His situation seems to have been quite precarious. He even remarked in 1702 that he was, quote, "without any salary." Reverend Lydius in Albany viewed the situation differently, noting that, quote, "it seems that Freeman cares for nothing if he can only earn a stiver by preaching," a comment which may have contained at least a hint of the truth. Regardless of the extent of Freeman's materialism, his financial situation in Schenectady seems to have been untenable. A possible alternative arose in 1702, when the Long Island congregations, there's Long Island, these are the congregations. A possible alternative arose in 1702 when the Long Island congregations of Brooklyn, Midveld, also known as Flatbush, Amersfoort, and New Utrecht approached him as a possible replacement for their recently deceased minister. How they became aware of Freeman is unclear, but the consistories later noted that, quote, "Freeman had by earnest solicitations and intrigues stirred up many in our congregation to call him," unquote. While the consistories preferred to call a minister from the Netherlands, they nevertheless felt, well, quote, "compelled to gratify the desire of some within their congregations." Before calling Freeman, however, they considered it wise to first seek the approval of the royal governor, Lord Cornbury. Whether the English royal government had any civil jurisdiction in Dutch Reformed ecclesiastical affairs had previously arisen in the context of the Manhattan congregation's efforts to call a second minister in the 1690s, but the answer to the question remained ambiguous. The consistory's decision to consult Cornbury unfortunately caused conflict to erupt in the Long Island congregations. Some church members remarked that the governor, quote, had nothing to do with it. 'Twas their privilege to send for what minister they pleased without your excellency's leave, end quote. They further expect, quote, no patience to wait for your excellency's answer. It is unclear whether this response was primarily a statement of principle or whether they were concerned that the governor might deny the request. In any event, Freeman supporters therefore boldly attempted to circumvent the elders by commissioning 3 others to call Freeman, clearly overstepping their rights within the congregation and thus flirting with schism. His supporters also began to go door to door to solicit subscriptions for his salary, which again was not their place. This did not stop the elders from petitioning Cornbury, however, who was apparently aware of the current dissension in the congregations, and he therefore rejected the petition. The governor remarked, quote, Freeman has not behaved well in the continuation and encouragement of the dissensions among the people of this province, end quote, perhaps a reference to the Leislerian troubles. And it was later reported that the governor described Freeman as, quote, a seditious and quarrelsome person with all with whom he had any dealings. Cornbury nevertheless gave the elders leave to call a minister from the Netherlands, although again, it was unclear whether such permission was needed. The governor, for whatever reason, however, changed his mind, which led to Freeman's being called to Long Island in May 1703. Freeman, however, found the contractual terms of the call insufficient, as the congregations had only offered an annual salary of £100, end quote. Also, the dwelling house as it now stands, together with the little barn and the land as far as the road and the garden, along with firewood. Freeman therefore requested that it be improved, although he suggested to the Long Island congregations that it was not he that was troubled by the offer, but rather the Schenectady congregation. His congregation supposedly asked him, quote, had he duly considered the call, that the salary mentioned in the call did not reach up to the proper amount by at least £25, and that the orchard and pasturage were withheld from me. Freeman further told the Long Island congregations that the Schenectady congregation would not formally dismiss him unless the financial terms were improved. Freeman also claimed that Schenectady, unlike Long Island, was willing to increase his salary to £125, although they further agreed to dismiss him if the southerly congregations would meet that new offer. This seems to have been subterfuge, as the Schenectady congregation was not even able to pay Freeman according to their existing contract. In reality, Schenectady actually did not want to dismiss him on any terms. As they fumed to the governor, quote, such a small congregation as we are, they would not be able to send for another, while they who are of a greater congregation could have another before this, if they had not endeavored to deprive us, their neighbors. The Schenectady congregation's unwillingness to dismiss Freeman put him in a difficult position. Freeman remarked that he was, quote, greatly embarrassed and knew not what to do. To leave without a certificate would be no advantage to me, for they would refuse to install me in my office there in Long Island. And further that, quote, to leave without a certificate would only be to make myself ridiculous. Freeman, however, was not as committed to the church order as he claimed. As upon Schenectady's refusal, he nevertheless preached my farewell and thought to myself, they will certainly now give it to me after that, but they still remained obstinate. Still, he, quote, finally concluded to leave anyhow. In total, he claimed both that he had to follow the rules, but that he was willing to break them if it suited his interests. This represented the beginning of a pattern. In addition to the financial terms of employment, Freeman was also resistant to another of the Long Island congregation's demands, which was that he place himself under the jurisdiction of the Classis of Amsterdam. The Manhattan ministers had previously requested the same when Freeman joined with Schenectady, but he had refused. The congregations on Long Island requested as such in case a dispute might arise between themselves and Freeman, claiming that, quote, because they belonged to the Classis of Amsterdam, if he remained connected to the Classis of Lingen, there would be no assembly that could formally resolve the conflict. Freeman categorically refused, claiming that he simply could not do so. As he remarked, quote, it is not in my power to withdraw myself from the Classis of Lingen, for if I did so, I would thereby renounce my ministerial character altogether. For it was that Classis which sent me over and no other, and it was that Classis which ordained me, end quote. This response was disingenuous, since he could have asked Lingen for permission to place himself within the orbit of the Classis of Amsterdam, but he never did. In other words, his argument was one of convenience. In any event, the Long Island congregations were unwilling to meet his demands, such that Freeman remained in Schenectady for a time. Since Freeman had not accepted their call, 3 of the 4 congregations who had called him from Schenectady, Brooklyn, Midveld, and Amersfoort, wrote to the Classis of Amsterdam in December 1703 for its assistance in sending a new minister to them, noting that they had received the governor's approval to do so. The decision to do so seems to have been very divisive. One congregation, that of New Utrecht, chose not to participate in the endeavor, and according to Freeman, writing several years later, quote, only half the village of Brooklyn, scarcely half of Flatbush, pretty near the half of New Amersfoort, quote, unquote, agreed to turn to the Classis, although I'm not sure his statistics can be trusted. Unaware of this division, the Classis of Amsterdam selected Reverend Vincentius Antonides for the position in October 1704. On January 1st, 1706, not long after his arrival, Antonides and his elders approached Cornbury, quote, to pay our dutiful respects, but they received, to their great surprise, the distressing answer that His Excellency was not willing that Domine Antonides should enter on his duties on Long Island, as a minister was already there, end quote. That was news to Antonides and his elders. Apparently because, quote, His Excellency did not want Dutch ministers too rapidly to increase and multiply in numbers. We were obliged to withdraw with this uncomfortable and soul-piercing answer. That other minister on Long Island was Freeman. How Freeman came to serve on Long Island slightly over 2 years after he had not accepted the congregation's call is complicated, and at the risk of sounding a bit like a partisan in the controversy, I find it difficult not to see Freeman's action as being less than forthright, and I think I'm being nice there. The apparent reason he sought a post in Long Island 2 years after he had not accepted such a call was connected to his recent marriage to Margarita van Skate. Margarita had been born in Albany, but had moved to Manhattan with her mother sometime after her father's death in the 1670s. She married Freeman in August 1705, and like many Manhattanites today, she apparently was, quote, not inclined to go up north with him. I know it still rings true, doesn't it? He must have informed the New Utrecht congregation of his availability, as they issued him a new call on September 21st, 1705. New Utrecht was in a position to do so because they had remained aloof from the other Long Island congregations when, after Freeman had failed to accept the 1703 call, they called a minister from the Netherlands. This new call from New Utrecht, including that which Freeman had demanded in his 1703 call, which was a salary of £125. The call for New Utrecht also did not require Freeman to join with the Classis of Amsterdam. While this call was unquestionably legitimate, Freeman also intruded in the other towns as he made arrangements with those members of the Midveld and Brooklyn congregations who had opposed calling a minister from the Netherlands. Those that agreed to support Freeman nevertheless understood that they might not be in the position always to receive his services. Although they did not explain why, the reason seems obvious, which is that at the time, the congregations of those villages were awaiting the arrival of the minister whom they had formerly called from Amsterdam, Vincentius Antonides. In order for Freeman to commence his services in New Utrecht, 2 members of his consistory requested of Reverend Gualtierus Du Bois of Manhattan in November 1705 that he formally install Freeman into his new charge. Before Du Bois would consider doing so, Du Bois queried Freeman on 2 points relative to the call. The first was whether he had been formally dismissed from Schenectady. He had not, as Schenectady had remained as unwilling to dismiss him in 1705 as they had been 2 years earlier. Freeman therefore simply left, although he did obtain a note from 2 members of the Schenectady congregation attesting to the fact that the consistory would not dismiss him because they did not want to lose him. Although Freeman considered the note insufficient, Du Bois did not and said as much, to which Freeman replied, quote, in an angry frame of mind, that Reverend Du Bois might not think that he was the Pope of Rome, that he had not come here to be catechized, his office was to catechize others. In other words, Freeman would not accept Du Bois' attempt to be the arbiter of ecclesiastical propriety. Du Bois was also reticent to install Freeman in New Utrecht because he had heard that Freeman had reportedly said that he had been called to that pulpit along, quote, with the combined or neighboring churches, end quote. As such, Du Bois was concerned that he might not restrict himself to that congregation. Du Bois asked him what he meant by such a statement, to which Freeman responded that, quote, I am pastor of New Utrecht. I have also a private contract with Bushwick, and Gravesend also contributes towards me, end quote. Du Bois and his consistory pressed him further, asking, quote, do you consider yourself pastor, also of Brooklyn and Flatbush? Or did this consistory make a new call on you? He replied, no, but I wrote thus because there are also some persons in Brooklyn and Flatbush who pay towards my salary, end quote. He claimed, however, that, quote, he had no desire to preach it in those churches unless they invite me in an ecclesiastical manner, end quote. Sufficiently satisfied, Du Bois agreed to install Freeman into his New Utrecht congregation alone. Freeman, however, had other plans. Immediately after he had learned of Antonides' arrival in December 1705, he had gone directly to Governor Cornbury in the hopes that he would appoint him to all of the Long Island churches, even though he had been called to New Utrecht alone. The governor was willing to intervene, and on December 26, 1705, issued a statement that read, quote, Mr. Bernardus Freeman, greeting. You are hereby licensed, tolerated, and allowed to be minister of the Dutch congregation at New Utrecht, Flatbush, Brooklyn, and Bushwick in Kings County upon the island of Nassau in the said province of New York, provided for and during so long time as to me shall seem meet, end quote. This license and the lack of formal congregational calls except from New Utrecht sowed the seeds of a controversy that would take years to resolve. Shortly thereafter, Du Bois made the trek to New Utrecht to install Freeman. However, upon his arrival, Freeman presented a note to Du Bois, which he wanted Du Bois to read to the congregation, declaring that Freeman was to be the, quote, pastor of New Utrecht and the combined churches. Du Bois refused, both because it went against what Freeman had said earlier and because he lacked a call to all of those congregations. Freeman responded by exclaiming that he would have the note read by the Vorleser or lay reader instead. Du Bois thereupon remarked, quote, you may if you want to, there's no heresy in it, but neither does it give you any rights, end quote. Freeman threatened that if Du Bois did not install him, he would ask Reverend William Bertolf in New Jersey to install him, which was worrisome to Du Bois, as Bertolf, like Freeman, was not associated with the Classis of Amsterdam. To avoid that, Du Bois did install Freeman, although he specifically noted that he was doing so only for New Utrecht. Freeman soon went against his word to Du Bois and attempted to gain control of the Midwoud and Brooklyn congregations by independently selecting new consistories, surely made up of the disaffected who had not desired Antonides' services. Freeman claimed that he did so because, quote, there was no consistory there, and since he had been appointed minister here by order of my Lord Cornbury and not finding consistory here, I had to appoint one according to my own judgment and pleasure, end quote. He later remarked that even though there were those who claimed to be the consistory, those who had called Antonides, they were not. The reason being that they had held their positions for 3 years, in spite of the fact that the Church Order of Dort indicated that the term of elders and deacons is set at only 2 years. In other words, he argued that their terms had automatically ended, such that they were trying to govern illegally. This was indeed an odd argument to make, as both Antonides and the Classis of Amsterdam would later tell him. Freeman's actions thus produced a schism, with some adhering to Antonides and the consistories who called him, and others associated with Freeman and his newly selected consistories. In an attempt to heal this breach, Antonides' elders suggested to the opposition that both ministers serve the congregations together, provided that sufficient resources were available. Freeman would not even consider that possibility, for as Du Bois and Antonides informed the Classis, he verbally responded that he cannot enter upon any equal terms of peace with the consistory of those 3 villages, nor with Mr. Antonides, unless Mr. Antonides also takes but a license from the governor. Antonides understood this Antonides understood this offer to be, in effect, a refusal, as Freeman very well knows that my Lord Cornbury is unwilling to give him a license. Besides, if Freeman had served with Antonides, with the latter having received Besides, if Freeman had served with Antonides without the latter having received a license, he would have suggested that a government license was not required, but it was just that license that he claimed gave him rights in the several congregations. Antonides and his consistories, however, would not let Freeman's actions go unchallenged, but they also had to be careful not to challenge the governor directly. They therefore focused their attention on Freeman's having selected a new consistory, quote, without consulting the consistory in office. They further held forth that, quote, it is a silly and idle pretense of your reverence, emanating either from confusion of understanding or from wicked perversity, to say that our 2 years of terms of service had expired and terminated, and that therefore we had in fact ceased to be a consistory. They acknowledge that the term is indeed set at 2 years, yet, quote, when circumstances require it for the benefit of any congregation, that it is left to the discretion of the congregation to shorten or lengthen the term, end quote. Besides, once a consistory was selected, it remained in place until its authority was transferred to a new consistory. Antonides and his consistories also pointed out Freeman's inconsistency. Although he claimed that there was no consistory in either Brooklyn or Midwell, he did consider that of New Utrecht as legitimate, even though the consistories of all three congregations had been selected at the same time. Besides, Antonides asserted that Freeman had no right to install new consistories in congregations to which he had not been called. In total, Antonides suggested that Freeman was interpreting church order in whatever way best supported his own agenda. As for the governor's license, Antonides and his consistories did not challenge it directly, but they did encourage Freeman to consider, quote, how such persons are looked upon and estimated who, without any call or legal order from the churches, intrude into an office where they do not belong, end quote, directing him to, quote, let your own conscience be the judge. Still, Antonides' congregations were less than gentle. They remarked that, quote, Freeman had scornfully rejected all our peaceable offers to come to an agreement in the interests of peace and harmony. You have persevered obstinately in your usurped powers and have intruded yourself by a way which is not good and according to your own will into the service of the Lord, end quote. They therefore admonished Freeman not to install the new consistories that he had selected. Antonides was in part willing to press Freeman because his livelihood was at stake. But he was also deeply concerned that Freeman's questionable ecclesiastical actions would lead to the degeneration of the Dutch church in the colony. As he began his protest, quote, where there is a church, there must certainly be order. The Lord desires that in his church all things should be done decently and in order. Freeman, in bearing a license but without a call other than to New Utrecht, was in Antonides' eyes attempting to cast aside church order, which, to most Dutch Reformed, was simply unconscionable, heterodox, and dangerous, made only worse by the governor's willingness to interfere in Dutch Reformed ecclesiastical affairs. Although Freeman did not react positively to Antonides' admonition, he had slightly overplayed his hand. As Antonides' consistory soon noted to the classis, the justice of the peace learned that, quote, Freeman had appointed new elders and deacons before those in office had served their usual time or had been regularly discharged, and they informed the governor of such. Cornbury therefore ordered Freeman, quote, to leave all matters concerning the Dutch congregation in Kings County in the same condition as you found them, end quote, until he considered the matter. As such, Antonides and his consistories had made a wide decision in protesting Freeman's lack of adherence to church order without challenging the governor's license. In any event, Freeman complied and did not install the new consistories, at least at that time. Although Freeman viewed the situation differently from Antonides, he did accept Antonides' contention that regardless of the governor's license, formal calls were also required, which led him to what can only be considered an outlandish claim. What he now claimed was that he actually had been called to all of the congregations. He held that even though he had not accepted the 1703 call to all four congregations, he never formally rejected it, such that he could accept it even more than 2 years later, or presumably even later than that, if he so wished. As such, when Brooklyn, Midwell, and New Amersfoort sent a new call to Amsterdam to be filled, that call, according to Freeman, had been ecclesiastical illegal. Yet in claiming that he had finally accepted the call, he also refused to connect himself to the Classis of Amsterdam, even though that had been demanded in that call. According to his opponents, that requirement, quote, is now not only rejected, but treated with contempt and ridiculed by him. In other words, he claimed that the terms of his service were not what the congregations required, but what he declared them to be. This conflict left the churches extremely unsettled. Antonides' elders were initially concerned that they might run afoul of the governor if Antonides was to preach, although he soon decided that he must. Freeman, however, also conducted services in those same congregations on rotation, such that, quote, Domine Antonides must always give place to Domine Freeman, who boldly relies upon his license and boasts that he is the only legal minister being under the authority of Lord Cornbury. Antonides and his supporters apparently did not try to prevent Freeman from doing so, presumably to avoid Cornbury's wrath. Still, they foretold doom for their church, bemoaning that, quote, Domine Freeman knew enough to predict all of this to us, saying there was no liberty of conscience. by which they meant that if the church was to be controlled by the Anglican governor rather than themselves, its future had become extremely precarious. While Du Bois, Antonides, and their consistories attempted to resolve the conflict with Freeman and with the governor, they ultimately determined that they could not do so alone. Therefore, in May 1706, they finally wrote to the Classis of Amsterdam of the situation. They wailed, quote, "How sadly the Long Island church is despoiled, and how miserable is its condition, continuing as it does, thus deplorably rent in twain. The heads of the faction of Reverend Freeman seem irrefragably attached to his side, and they have set themselves out of pure passionateness against the consistory," end quote. But their concerns were much greater than divided congregations. Most importantly, if the English governor successfully arrogated to himself the ultimate power to license and appoint ministers to Dutch congregations who would serve at his pleasure, this foretold the end of the Dutch Reformed Church in America. As Du Bois and Antonides noted, rumor had it that the governor even planned, quote, "to send 1 or 2 English preachers to these congregations in Kings County, although there are no people living in the 3 villages who do not belong to the Dutch congregation." If the governor had his way, they feared he would effect a complete Anglicanization of the Dutch church in America. In explaining to the Classis the governor's intervention in Dutch ecclesiastical affairs, they certainly placed most of the blame on Freeman, but they also held the governor responsible. As they noted, quote, "For other reasons which are unknown to us, Cornbury seems to have expected more deference than his predecessors." Since they lacked the power to effectively challenge the governor, they submitted a request for redress that the Reverend Classis of Amsterdam would make a demand on the great pensionary of the United Provinces to have orders sent to the ambassador in England to obtain the following: that Her Majesty issue her command to her governor to allow the Dutch churches to continue in that condition in which they have been since the surrender of the country to the English crown. End quote, including the right to call ministers from Holland without obtaining the governor's approval, the ability of the justly called ministers to serve without obtaining the governor's permission, and the right to follow their own church discipline, all of which they claimed they had gained through the Articles of Capitulation, which had been accepted when the Dutch colony was transferred to England. In claiming that they sought only a return to the arrangements before Cornbury's intervention, Du Bois and Antonides actually reframed the historic relationship between the American ministers and congregations and the Classis in ways that were factually untrue. As they noted in their report to the Classis, quote, "The Dutch churches in said province, established by said West India Company and the ministers, have always been dependent upon the Reverend Classis of Amsterdam," end quote. While they were likely not aware that some ministers in New Netherland had lacked any direct connection to the Classis of Amsterdam, it was readily apparent to Du Bois and Antonides that of the 6 Dutch ministers in the colonies at the time of their report, only 4 had been sent by the Classis of Amsterdam. Indeed, one of the essential problems for Du Bois and Antonides is that Freeman himself was in no way dependent upon the Classis of Amsterdam, or perhaps upon any Classis at all. Neither was Reverend Bartolf in New Jersey associated with Amsterdam, a point they noted at the very same time they asserted the complete dependence of the American church in Amsterdam. That was an inconvenient truth that they aimed to obscure. In effect, what Du Bois and Antonides were actually seeking was a means to make the American ministers by definition dependent upon Amsterdam, all the while falsely claiming that they already were. As they stated in their request for redress, they hope for a future in which, quote, "any ministers of the Dutch church in the colonies who are not willing to submit to the orders and discipline of the said Classis of Amsterdam may be suspended from their office until the Reverend Classis shall have given their decision," end quote. They even hope that this would be directed by the British monarch so as to prevent those such as Freeman to willfully remain outside of the sphere of the Amsterdam Classis. In other words, Du Bois and Antonides tried to rewrite both the past and present in order to create a more stable future. There are a number of reasons why Du Bois and Antonides might have sought both a stronger and subordinate relationship to the Classis of Amsterdam. One reason was the need for a stronger power to counterbalance that of the governor. Du Bois and Antonides also felt the need to challenge Freeman, who had begun to, quote, "make the people believe that since we are so far off from the Classis of Amsterdam or any other Classis in Holland, that we have no transactions with the same," end quote. They further noted that, quote, "they have heard that he himself talks this everywhere, and so causes the church discipline in many points to be despised. He pretends that only is the church discipline which the congregation and the consistory deem necessary." In short, Du Bois and Antonides were attempting to subordinate In short, Du Bois and Antonides were attempting to subordinate the Americans to Amsterdam, not only to create a source of classical power, but to protect church order itself. The Classis was initially rather confused by the controversy, in part because letters from the Americans did not arrive in the order that they were penned. The Classis did eventually contact the Grand Pensionary concerning the governor's intervention, but nothing seems to have ever come from that effort. The Classis, however, did not act quickly, only writing to Du Bois and Antonides and Freeman in February 1709, over 2 years after they had learned of the controversy. While the stability of the American church was certainly of concern to the Classis, they were more worried that Cornbury's intervention might mean for the future liberty of the Dutch church in America. The Classis noted Antonides, quote, "The governor's order does indeed really take away the liberty of the Netherland churches, for it bears plainly the proof that the people in the king's dominions have no independent authority to call a minister, that you are only permitted to conduct your services at the options of others." End quote. They blamed this on Freeman's own self-interest, such that they wrote to him, quote, "May God forgive you for this evil deed." Unfortunately, the Classis thought the only way to bring matters into the old shape before the governor's intervention was for Antonides, Freeman, and their respective supporters to find a way towards peace. The Classis noted, quote, "While those differences remain, it will be a great hindrance to us in attaining our object. It cannot be expected that our efforts will bear much fruit if pressure is brought to bear against us, both on the part of the churches and with the governor in their favor." End quote. They also believed the best path would be for the several congregations to be served by both Antonides and Freeman. Still, they considered Freeman to be the instigator of the troubles, in part because they shared Antonides and his congregation's perspective that he indeed not accepted the 1703 call. They suggested that the best path would be to let bygones be bygones, however, not only between the colonial ministers, but also between Freeman and the Classis, as, quote, "You will enable us to forget all the past, which we will cover up in love, and thus will you also greatly promote the well-being of the church, of those churches." The most significant aspect of the Classis' response to the American ministers, however, was that it stated its own impotence in the matter. The Classis bluntly held that, quote, "You and your good friends can also readily see that we have no power in the domains of another nation to take special action against Freeman, especially since he has the government on his side," end quote. The Classis had never previously referred to its limited role in the colonies so transparently. Put simply, the Classis of Amsterdam was of the opinion that neither by definition nor in practice did it have classical authority over the church in an English colony, and neither could any other Dutch Classis. Even before the Americans received the classical letter, however, they had continued to move forward with their attempts to resolve the conflicts. Ironically, however, it was now Antonides and his faction who sought the intervention of the new governor, John Lovelace, who had replaced Cornbury in December of 1708. Lovelace did ask several members of the council, along with Du Bois and the Manhattan consistory, to look into the matter. Freeman maintained that that was inappropriate, since he asserted that the authority in church affairs rested solely with the governor, which again was a position that supported his claims. Antonides and Freeman, with their supporters, also tried to find their own solution by considering the possibilities that both would serve all the involved congregations, but neither would do so until the other agreed that they had been wrong. As a result, nothing positive came to pass. In the midst of this continuing conflict, Du Bois and Antonides received the Classis' response, a response that utterly shocked them, which they expressed in a June 1709 letter. While they thanked the Classis for its efforts to protect the liberty of the colonial church, they were simply stunned by what they viewed as the Classis' seeming willingness to accept Freeman's actions. They exclaimed, quote, "For we could not believe, one, that the Classis intended to convey the idea that anyone could be recognized as a lawful minister who had no regular ecclesiastical call, two, or that a lawful consistory could be deposed by a magistrate who did not even belong to our church, and that he might then appoint an unlawful consistory in its place of the other, although done by the connivance of a usurping minister who was upheld by that same governor's authority. And three, much less that we must approve such a deposition and such an appointment, and then be obliged to assist in upholding such a minister." Antonides and Du Bois simply could not understand how the class would not repudiate one who so fundamentally trampled on the church order. However, they misunderstood the Classis' position. The Classis certainly did not consider Freeman's actions legitimate, but if peace was to be achieved, they found it necessary to show some restraint. As if they had condemned Freeman too harshly, he would just turn away from them and continue to act on his own. In the wake of the Classis' February 1709 response, both Antonides and Freeman nevertheless continued to attempt to employ the civil government to resolve the controversy. However, the quick succession of several men serving in the governor's role and a divided council led to a series of contradictory decisions, some which favored Freeman and the others favoring Antonides, such that the situation became even more muddled than before. If that was not bad enough, the Classis of Amsterdam soon penned a letter to Du Bois and Antonides in July 1710 that reiterated its position that it lacked the right to serve as the Classis for the colony. They noted, quote, "Those differences with Reverend Freeman continue to exist, and these go deeply to our hearts. This is especially so because we lack the power to do anything definitively against him in another kingdom. Although you wish we would, by our counsel and action, terminate these differences, we do not find ourselves in a condition to do so." The Classis position therefore left the colonial church in a fundamentally untenable position. As it was, the Americans alone could not resolve ecclesiastical controversies of the likes of the Antonides-Freeman conflict. Neither would the colonial ministers accept government intervention if it did not help them achieve their various agendas, such that when the government did intervene, it only exacerbated the conflict. And without a Classis to resolve the conflict, the colonial church had to function in a congregational rather than a presbyterial way, even though presbyterial governance was what defined the Dutch Reformed way, in part because it provided a structure to resolve internal challenges. From the perspective of the Classis of Amsterdam, the only path open to the American ministers and congregations was simply to get along and follow the church order the best they could. But that was just the problem, as the congregations and ministers themselves could not agree on how the church should be governed, even at the congregational level. In short, the American church was left in anarchy. Unfortunately, the 1710 letter to Antonides did not reach him, and neither did another 1710 classical letter to Freeman. This prompted the Classis to write again in July 1711 in a similar vein. Once again, they opined to Antonides, quote, "Concerning the contentions in your churches, we declare that they sorely grieve us, and especially because we are lacking in power to do anything definitively against Freeman, so as to forward the wished for rest and peace. You indeed desire that we should by our counsel adjust these divisions, yet we find ourselves unable to do so." To Freeman, they asserted that the call that brought Antonides to America was indeed legitimate, and that when Freeman did not accept the 1703 call in 1703, he essentially rendered it null and void. The Classis also told Freeman that his pursuit and receipt of the governor's license was a dangerous precedent that, quote, "thus prepared the way for the loss of liberty to all the churches." The Classis implored him to, quote, "try rather to do all that you can that tend towards their peace. If you should be called elsewhere, all difficulties would be removed, or you might adjust the business with Antonides in the way proposed by us, or by the consistories of Long Island, which would have been both serving all the congregations together." When the new governor, Robert Hunter, arrived, he, like his predecessors, became involved in the Long Island controversy, and again, like him, was unable to resolve it. He did, however, suggest a new approach, which again suggested that the Classis of Amsterdam had an extremely circumscribed role in the American colonies. According to Antonides' consistories, quote, "His Excellency even offered to lay the case before some Classis or synod, which we might agree upon naming him and request its decision. This decision, however, would only be binding if the parties agreed, quote, by the honor of their office to conduct ourselves according to the decision of such Classis or synod." They all initially agreed, but Freeman was unwilling to select the Classis of Amsterdam as he considered it partial. He was then given the opportunity to make the selection, choosing the Classis of Leeuwarden in Friesland, where Antonides had previously served. This shopping around for a Classis would have been simply impossible if the colonial congregations were formally subordinate to the Classis of Amsterdam. In any event, Freeman ultimately changed his mind and would not agree to abide by any outside decision, quote, saying that he wished to have nothing to do with any Classis or synod. As Antonides' consistories later said, Freeman, quote, "derived evidence from Classis' letters that there is no such great necessity to bind oneself to church order here, because we are under no Classis here whose power by its own confession extends so far even to give advice." The Classis' 1711 letters to Freeman and Antonides had apparently arrived by March of 1712, which prompted Freeman to once again approach Antonides in pursuit of peace. Their terms, however, had not changed, which included in part that Antonides required that Freeman, quote, "should firmly bind yourselves together with the other ministers in America to the church order of our Dutch national church, according to the Synod of Dort, 1618-19, and subject yourself to the Reverend Classis of Amsterdam." Antonides was of the mind that this would produce stability in the future, all the while ignoring the fact that the class maintained that it lacked all ecclesiastical power in a foreign nation. The result was the impasse remained. Both Freeman and Antonides, with their consistories, replied to the Classis' 1711 letters concerning the breakdown in negotiations. Freeman merely reiterated his claims and downplayed the asserted dangers that the governor's license presented. Antonides' consistories affected a tragic stance. They bemoaned the troubles that, quote, press us the more heavily and pain us the more severely because you openly write to us and make the same known also by copies to Reverend Freeman that you have no power to do anything effectual against Reverend Freeman for the furtherance of the general rest and peace. Yea, that even upon our wish and petition, you do not find yourself able to serve us with any counsel or to be of any aid in taking away those dissensions. This is a declaration which strengthens Reverend Freeman tremendously, end quote. Although they exaggerated the situation, as the Classis did provide its advice and guidance, their response reveals the extent of their feelings of vulnerability and isolation. As they wailed, quote, are we then independent, orphans without a father? O Lord, help us. Unfortunately, they remarked, quote, we are now forced to acknowledge that when the cord of a recalcitrant is stretched to the utmost, no ecclesiastical sentence pronounced can be executed because the overshadowing of political authority is necessary thereunto. They nevertheless requested that the Classis give your judgment and sentence upon such a conduct with a declaration of the punishment deserved if such a one were within reach of lawful ecclesiastical censure, so that it might serve to the confusion of the malefactors and deter others from similar undertakings, end quote. Although such judgment was unenforceable, it would at least reflect a reasoned ecclesiastical opinion. Much else that Antonides' consistories communicated to the Classis about the conflict simply repeated what had been said before. They also reiterated their understanding that Freeman ultimately pursued the governor's license after not having accepted the 1703 call because, quote, his wife, whom he was then about to marry, was not willing to go to Schenectady to live. So it was repeated. But they also suggested, quote, that which Freeman failed to do then at Albany, he has accomplished in the case of our pastor. He invaded his churches not before, but just as his arrival. Thus he takes revenge for the wrong then done to him by the Classis. For even now he does not scruple to say that the place at Albany rightly belonged to him. Although this was hearsay provided by Freeman's opponents, it is very plausible that was indeed what Freeman believed. The Classis eventually responded to this request by first expressing their deep concern for the American church, which was reflected in their consistent, quote, counsels and exhortations to mutual peace and adjustment of differences, and also something special which was proposed to your consideration as conducive to that end, end quote. Yet the Amsterdam ministers also distanced themselves from what they had previously said. They remarked that they had not previously attempted to direct colonial affairs They remarked that they had not previously attempted to direct colonial affairs due to their lack of the necessary knowledge to do so. That was decidedly not the reason that they had previously given. The Classis also explained their previous unwillingness to offer its judgment because they believed that it would be better if it did not. They remarked that, quote, the Classis has not thought it expedient to give a decision because she anticipated that by such means the desired end of quietness and peace would probably not be secured. Then again, how often does it happen in ecclesiastical assemblies that though they are possessed of sufficient information, yet they pursue a plan of seeking to effect an amicable adjustment and pacification by mutual conference rather than to impose a decision. In this, the circumstances are such that not only our love for peace, but our wisdom and prudence lead us thus to act. That approach may indeed have been wise, especially considering Freeman's refusal to be associated with Amsterdam, but it was simply not in accord with their previous view, which was that since an enforceable classical decision was not possible for congregations and ministers in British colonies, the Classis had not rendered one. It is not precisely clear why the Classis so dramatically reframed the situation, but perhaps they thought what had been previously said about the American church put the church on a knife's edge, such that fiction might be more helpful than fact. Even if the Americans were not, nor could not be, formally subject to the Classis' decisions, the Classis thought it was clearly unwise for the Americans to consider themselves independent, as it was just that which had motivated Freeman. To put this another way, the classis seemed to be attempting to retract its former position, which was that it could not serve as the classis for the colonies, not because it was untrue, but because they feared that it would hurt the American church. What gave the classis the opportunity to change its position was that Antonides and his consistories had clearly requested a classical decision, hoping that if all parties were willing to accept it, it might produce a resolution, even if it was not formally binding. In other words, if the Americans were willing to defer to the classis, then its lack of power to enforce a decision would be moot. But if Freeman was to accept its decision, the classis would have to tread lightly, and they did so by constructing a judgment in which both Freeman and Antonides were victors. To Antonides, they simply requested that he overlook what Freeman had done. The Amsterdam ministers wrote, quote, "The classis does not demand of you that you shall consider the call of Reverend Freeman to have been illegal or to declare it to be legal. No, indeed. We are aware that as long as one is of the contrary opinion, that he cannot do this. But the classis demands this of you, that you drop the whole dispute regarding the legality or illegality of the call out of common love for peace. And by a Christian indulgence, overlook that which, according to your judgment, may be considered illegal in his call, and that you henceforth treat and meet him as it is customary to treat and meet a lawful pastor." In writing to Freeman's consistories, the classis used similar but not identical language, remarking, quote, one must not stand upon the circumstances that the call must be acknowledged as legal, but the dispute concerning the legality or illegality of the call must, out of love and peace, be entirely dropped. And in Christian indulgence must be overlooked whatever one considers not to have been exactly according to proper order. And henceforth, each must treat and meet the respective pastors as is customary. The classis also indicated that both ministers should serve together and draw equal salaries. Of Freeman himself, the classis asked slightly more, but not that he subordinate himself to the Classis of Amsterdam, which he had repeatedly refused to do. Rather, they simply asked that he, quote, maintain all proper correspondence with his classis. For on this subject, they seem to have imbibed some misgivings about you, but by an open declaration on your part, these can easily be removed. They also asked that he, quote, give assurances to the other brethren that he will adhere to the Netherlands church order. These classical letters had their desired result, principally because Antonides and Freeman themselves agreed to accept the path set forth by the classis, which ironically produced the same result that Freeman and Antonides have been trying to work out for years. This led Reverend Du Bois to rejoice, quote, thank God, the New York church dispute and the grievous evils connected with them have at last been brought to a close. God keep us from such things in the future. Even as we ourselves hope to guard against such evils by the exercise of all prudence, that we may not again be brought under bondage. End quote. To obtain this result, however, the transatlantic ecclesiastical relationship had been reimagined. Whereas the classis initially held that it had no ecclesiastical power in the colonies, Antonides and his consistories, with Du Bois's support, wanted to change that by choosing to defer to classical power even while not formally subject to it. Freeman never did become as differential, but the Freeman-Antonides affair represents the turning point in the transatlantic ecclesiastical relationship in ways that ultimately led to the Cetus Conferentiae dispute. Before Freeman, the American church was indeed independent of any formal classical power. But through the controversy and at a request that came from America, independence was transformed into deference. That deference would later be reimagined into subordination, which became the key issue in the Cetus Conferentiae dispute. But that's a story for another time. Thank you.